Welcome to the Mind of Business Success podcast. I'm your host, Alicia Kramer. Our guest today is Evan Johnson. Let's talk about podcasting and all of the awesome things it can do for you in your business. Welcome to the show, Evan.
Thank you very, very much for having me. It is always fun to be a guest instead of a host, so this is exciting.
That's right. And for anyone who hasn't listened to my episode where I'm interviewed on your podcast, let's do a little plug for that right now. Go check it out.
Heck
So let's
yeah.
start with talking about your podcast. Can you tell us a little bit about your podcast, the name, where people can find it, what you talk about?
My podcast is called Path to Podcast Success. You can find it wherever you listen to podcasts. And I speak with entrepreneurs and business owners like you, talking about all things business, your journey, the journeys of my guests, insights they can share, actionable strategies that my listeners can take and implement, all that fun stuff. It's really just me having really fun conversations with other business owners, packed with a lot of value from that.
Very, very awesome. And you actually took me into a little bit of backstory about my journey as a podcaster, which started over 11 years ago, which a lot of people don't realize because this particular podcast is only about a year and a half old at the time of recording. So that was super fun. And highly, highly, highly recommend everybody check your podcast out.
Well, thank you for saying that. That's definitely it is. I try to have as much fun as I can when I'm interviewing people because if you're not having fun, then what's the point?
So true. So
Yeah.
I'll share a quick story, which is so relevant to that statement because I was recently interviewed on a different podcast and it felt a little awkward.
Mm.
Not from my perspective, but because sometimes people are doing a podcast for the wrong reasons. They are kind of sold into it like every other marketing tactic. Oh, you have to do a podcast, you have to do Facebook ads, you have to do this. And it's not always the right fit for some people. So they're trying to make it fit, but there's this unnatural, kind of uncomfortable quality when people are sort of out of their element. For a lot of people, they are excited about doing a podcast. Maybe they already have podcasts and they want to sort of ramp things up and get more exposure. Maybe they're considering doing a podcast because it would be really beneficial for their business, but maybe they have a little bit of hesitation, a little stage fright or something like that. I'd love from your all of your years of experience, where do you direct people when they're in that sort of I want to do it but I'm not really the most confident, or they're maybe doubting themselves and their ability to be successful in this area? What would you say to someone in that situation?
That is a very good question. First of all, I am obviously a little bit biased towards having a podcast and the benefits that that can have. However, at the end of the day, whether it's podcasting, Facebook ads, establishing an email list, social media posting, whatever the business strategy is that you're thinking about doing, only do it if you want to do it and if you know how it actually fits into the business, right? Because if you don't have one of those things, if you don't have both of those things, then that's where you're going to get the awkward, stale types of shows where there's just not a lot of thought put into it, and people can tell. So you have to have that sorted out. And as far as the confidence side, that's very funny that you mentioned that. When I was growing up, I was a very shy, introverted kid. Right, it was always terrifying when I was called on in class to speak on whatever the topic is. And I started my business of producing podcasts, and then a little bit down the road I realized, well, I need a podcast, right? I need to practice what I preach. I don't want to be an overweight fitness instructor or a broke financial manager like, or a coach without a coach. Like I need to be able to actually back up what I'm saying when I tell people how great podcasting is. I need to have one too. So that's why I started mine. It was scary, but I mean, if anyone needed to do it, it was me. And I pretty much just jumped in. I never got any negative feedback. Yeah, sure, my first episodes were pretty awkward. I hope no one goes back and listens to those first ones. I hope they start with the recent ones. But after doing it, I'm coming up on like 300 episodes now released. And after doing it for so long, I mean, I've honestly completely changed as a person. I consider myself now more an extrovert than an introvert, and that's honestly mostly due to the podcast and hosting these conversations. And when you kind of throw yourself under the fire and have to conduct almost 300, conversations with new people, then it's kind of a sink or swim moment. So if someone is thinking about starting a podcast and they know they want to and they know how it actually adds value to their business, but they're a little bit nervous about doing it and about putting themselves out there like that. Unfortunately, it really does come down to you just have to do it anyway. There's no fancy like tip or trick to get past it. You just have to do it. And you have to know that any negative repercussions you're thinking about happening are 100% just in your head.
That's a really, really, really important point. Most of people's fears are completely in their head. So many people hold themselves back from the things that they want to do because they have these unreasonable fears. And one of the things that I'll oftentimes tell clients when they're wanting to embark on something new, whether it's writing a book and they don't necessarily think they have the chops to be an author, or they want to, start recording videos or whatever it is. When you first start, you're going to feel completely uncomfortable. I mean, unless for some reason there's a little carryover from some other area in your life, right? Meaning, if somebody was naturally an article writer, sure, there's a natural transition into being an author of a book. But if there's no knowns in the subconscious mind, then when you sit down to do it, it's not going to feel natural. And so oftentimes what I'll say is do it for yourself first, meaning, get on camera and just talk to yourself, record yourself on Zoom, do some of those sort of dry runs so that you start to create knowns in your subconscious mind. It starts to feel more natural. It starts to feel more normal. You've got to get that out of the way so that when you're doing the thing now for the real, the real game, so to speak, you're coming into it with your mind somewhat programmed to do that thing. And you're still not going to be very good at it. But none of us are great at most things the first time we start. And you're going to get better.
Yes, exactly. And that's the thing is you have to start in order to get to that point where you're good at whatever it is you're trying to get good at. I mean, you have to release episode 1 of a podcast to get to episode 100 of a podcast. And so there comes a point where you have to just do the thing that you want to do, knowing that all those fears are really just in your head.
Let's talk about some of the benefits.
Mm.
So, you mentioned, of course, you're a little biased, right? Based on your business, but there really are quite a few benefits. And some of them are maybe a little bit more obvious, right? Exposure and things like that. And maybe some of them are a little less obvious, like you talked about, you changed as a person.
Yeah.
Let's go into that a little bit more. Let's talk about some of those benefits, the known and the unknown ones of having your own podcast.
Yeah, no, there are a lot. Like I said, I'm definitely biased, but it kind of speaks for itself, and you can see these benefits play out in businesses that have podcasts. There's the obvious ones. It establishes you as an expert in what you're doing because having a podcast is impressive. I've definitely got a lot of people, if I mention I have a podcast, respond with the, oh wow, oh my gosh, okay, that's so cool, etc., etc. It's very similar to having a book. It's something anyone could do, but few people actually do. And the people who actually do it, like you and me, sometimes it's difficult to remember that it's not commonplace. Because for me, I mean, I'm podcasting almost every day. It's very easy. I'm very comfortable with it. It feels like a nature to me. And I'm sure you probably have a similar feeling sometimes when you're doing it. Like, it doesn't seem like it's like some huge deal to have a podcast. But for a lot of people, it is because a lot of people don't have podcasts, and people you're looking to work with in business can see that and recognize that, and so that's one of the best. That's one of the best benefits of having a podcast. Otherwise, besides all the same benefits you'd get from having content out there, exposure, all that fun stuff, there's a few benefits that not a lot of people really take into consideration. There's the confidence factor. I mean, that was what it did for me. It was one of the most unexpected benefits for me. It was starting a podcast and then essentially completely changing as a person. I mean, I am extroverted. I consider myself outgoing now, and I owe a lot of that to the podcast. But my personal favorite benefit that I get out of having a podcast, the thing that I enjoy the most, is the relationships that I get to make. Right? Like now, you and I know each other because I invited you to be a guest on my podcast, and we had that conversation, and it was powerful, and it was interesting, and it was fun. And I can't even begin to explain just the personal satisfaction I've had from being able to meet exciting and interesting new entrepreneurs and make new friends in that way in that space. And on top of that, from a business standpoint, I'm sure a significant amount of the clients that I have today. Well, I know that actually, yeah, a lot of the clients I have today are from relationships that I've generated from guests I've had on my podcast. And that's something I feel like not a lot of people think about. They think of just, oh, how can I make money with sponsors or whatever. But the money is really in having those relationships and making them meaningful. So that's some of the things that I've gotten from a podcast that really resonate with me.
I love that. And I'll just add my 2 cents to it because
Oh yeah.
I'm with you 100%. There are so many benefits that a lot of people don't actually consider. Um, it's not uncommon for me to get on Zoom ready, to record an episode, and the guest will say, why'd you get into this? Why'd you start your podcast? And it's fun for me because then I get to tell a little bit of my story, which is, yeah, I had my other podcast 11 years ago now. And that was definitely a marketing tool, right? That was the mindset was you use a podcast as a marketing tool for your business. But during that time, I had created some really great friendships, met some really incredible people who went on to become, business partners and collaboration partners, and just even people that I'm still connected to this day. And when I was, um, when I was in networking, I was in a couple of different networking groups and a referral group. And I'm with all of these incredible entrepreneurs. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, it's great, giving referrals here and there when you can, but what else can I do to add more value to these relationships? And then I thought to myself, of course, I'll do a podcast because then I can feature them. I can help get more exposure to their businesses. And really, that was sort of the initial inspiration for this particular podcast. But it's so far above and beyond just giving to my inner circle of friends and colleagues and clients. It's all of these incredible people that I get to meet, and I've formed so many strategic partnerships with guests that have come onto the podcast. It oftentimes will surprise me when people will say, oh, I listened to that episode on your podcast and I didn't even realize that they listened to my podcast. It sort of has its own energy, and it has this outreaching ability that is beyond a conventional marketing approach in many cases, because you're adding so much value to people's lives. And it's great to be able to add your own value to people's lives, right? Like you're the expert at what you do, I'm the expert at what I do, but it's so flipping cool to be able to say, this person is so cool and they're going to be on my podcast and they're going to share the most amazing information with all of you, and you benefit from that and everybody else benefits from that. And there really are so many really great reasons to add podcasting to your business, if, of course, caveat, if it feels like the right thing for you.
Exactly. And that's the thing is it doesn't work if you're not feeling like it fits or if you're doing it because you feel like you should do it. It has to be something that you want to do and are looking forward to actually doing.
Absolutely. Let's shift gears just a little bit. You talked a little bit about your own sort of confidence building experience with podcasting.
Hmm.
From your perspective as the entrepreneur, as the business owner, whether we're talking about your podcast or we're talking about your business in a more general sense, I'd love to talk a little bit about your own mindset journey as a business owner and maybe one thing that you've personally had to work through and overcome in order to get to where you are today.
That is a really good question. I'd say definitely the thing that I had to work on the most and that has been the most valuable as far as a mindset, I guess, barrier or block that I was able to work through to get me to where I am today was lack of confidence, turning that into having confidence. Because pretty much everything you do in business ties back to that, right? If you're on a sales call with someone or if you're trying to sell someone on your services, I mean, if you're not confident in what you're doing, it's not going to happen. And it's so many times throughout the whole process of having a business and scaling that business and generating new, generating revenue for that business, it all comes down to having that confidence. And I started my business back when I was like 16, 17. I was still in high school. Um, and I was always a shy kid, like I said before. I didn't have a lot of confidence. And so I fell victim to a lot of the kind of predatory marketing you see a lot online. I definitely put some money into courses that didn't really do much for me. And eventually I had to figure out, eventually I figured out that I can run a business how I want to run a business, right? I can do what feels right to me in a way that feels meaningful to me. And if I do that, then I have confidence in what I'm doing because I believe in it. And that's what helps generate that confidence. And that, and of course, hosting the podcast and having so many conversations with new people completely changed everything. And so that's really the main thing is the confidence. That is what I was able to overcome throughout running a business and how that really impacted where I'm at today. Because having clients or bringing in money or having a business doesn't work if you're not confident in yourself and what it is that you're doing. So that I think was really powerful for me.
It's definitely powerful. You're right. Confidence is a huge piece. And a lot of people are struggling with self doubt and confidence issues. As as both a hypnotherapist and a mindset coach, I can't tell you, how many people who in some cases even would appear to be fairly confident people are struggling with confidence issues in certain areas of their life and in their business. And there is this crazy almost like cliche idea that people have of successful people, that they're arrogant, they're boastful, they're overly confident. And so when somebody doesn't feel like they fit that image, they kind of write themselves off as though they can't be as successful. And that's just simply not the case. I've personally found that most of my clients are not that way. Some of them certainly are more confident in certain areas of life or business than other people, but you don't have to be arrogant. In fact, all the better if you're not, right? Legitimate, genuine confidence is really about being congruent with ourselves, which is what I heard you say. It's about don't do things just because some guru that has put themselves on a pedestal over you says you're supposed to do. Do it if it feels right for you, and find ways to run your business that feel like you're in integrity with yourself. And that, I think, is a really important piece of confidence. And the rest, like you said, we develop it. It's not always a known in our own mind until we actually start to take some action and develop the belief in ourselves that we can do it.
Exactly. That's the thing is you have to believe that you actually can do it. And I know it sounds cliche, but a lot of the stuff that sounds cliche is true. So you need to be able to actually believe in yourself. Like, do you think you can actually do this? If the answer is yes, that's the foundation you can build all of it on. Yeah.
So true. So now let's go back onto the subject of podcasting again for a little bit. You've interviewed a lot of people, around 300, you said.
Mm-hmm.
Now, from a practical perspective,
Mm-hmm.
some people are saying, how do you even find 300 people to interview?
Well, it's honestly not very difficult. To be real with you, I pretty much just when I'm scrolling Facebook, Facebook will give me a list of recommended friends, and I browse that list and I see if someone looks like they have a professional looking profile of what they're doing in the world of business looks interesting, and if I feel like they might have value to share on my podcast, I reach out to them and I chat with them and I invite them on my podcast. And there is uh, way more than 300 people on Facebook, and most people have at least a few thousand Facebook friends already. So honestly, that's how I find my guests, and that, and getting referrals from other guests. But mainly, if I'm looking for guests, that's where I go.
That's very cool. So I'll share a couple insider secrets as well,
Yeah.
since we want to provide massive value here.
Oh
So
yeah.
when I decided I was going to launch this podcast, obviously I already had quite a few people in my network
Mhm.
who were very eager to come on. But there are so many different groups also. Facebook is a great place to find groups where people are looking for podcast opportunities,
Oh yeah.
and just you post, hey, launching a podcast, and this is what it's about. If you fit this particular demographic, um, reach out. And that is one way. There are tons of sites also where they're connecting podcasts with podcast guests. A lot of them are free for people, so you can find people who fit your ideal podcast guest demographic. And I promise there is no shortage of people looking for places to be to be on podcasts. We have so many inquiries. I luckily don't have to see most of them. My assistant deals with all of that stuff, but literally my calendar only goes out 6 months in advance, and we are always fully booked.
Oh my goodness.
So, and that's without even really trying. So,
Well, that's the
you know,
thing. People need to. Well, something that people really need to keep in mind is that people like guesting on podcasts.
mhm.
You're not selling anything. It's free marketing for them. So when you send a cold DM asking someone to be a guest on a podcast, if they see the message, they're probably going to say yes, or at least ask for more information because again, you're not trying to sell anything. And I think a lot of people kind of forget that. I remember when I first started my podcast, I was like 19. Didn't really have any much of an online presence, and so I was starting this podcast, and I reached out to entrepreneurs, business owners who were established, asking them to be a guest. Pretty much all of them said yes. Even the ones who asked for asked some follow up questions. And I was like, yeah, the podcast it doesn't exist yet. I'm like pre-recording interviews, getting ready to launch. They're like, oh, okay, cool, great, yeah, I'll do it. People are really willing to do it. I didn't have a single person say no, and I recorded like 10 interviews before I even launched my podcast. So like people think it's a lot harder than it really is. It's pretty easy.
Let's carry on that topic of thinking it's harder than it actually is. Over the years, I've helped a couple of different clients when I was doing my consulting work as well, launch podcasts. And it really is quite easy. Most people have the basic technology that they need, whether it's Zoom or some other software that you're using to record. You buy yourself a microphone or some type of headset or something like that. And as long as you have a few basics, you're kind of off to the races. But now some people like to take it a little bit further, and they want to have fancy editing, and they want to have the intro and the outro, and they maybe want to have um, um, like transcription or the little teasers and stuff like that. Let's talk about some of those things and kind of break down for people what are the must-haves and what are the not necessarily must-haves, but you can also do these things.
Pretty much when it comes to a podcast, there are no rules really. You can do whatever you want and you can still come up with a successful podcast. There are definitely some best practices. It depends on what a person's budget is, right? They can hire someone like myself to really take care of all of that work and they only need to show up and record the episode. That's usually best case scenario for most people. If that is not something that they have access to, if they don't have the money for a service like mine, then it's fairly easy to do it cheap and free, or cheap or free, and without too much time commitment. It's just that the quality of the finished podcast would reflect that. I'd say get yourself a USB microphone off of Amazon. That's all you really need, and pretty much just go to town with that. That really sets you up better than a lot of people I've talked to with podcasting. I had a client of mine who records his podcast on his phone on the drive home from dropping his son off at school, and his download numbers are absolutely insane. I don't even know how he does it. And so it's a lesson that you can do anything and still find success. But pretty much, get yourself a microphone, go ahead and record an intro and an outro, get some royalty free music. You don't want to do anything that's going to get you into copyright trouble, and put that over the intro and the outro, and then just put that on the beginning and the end of your episode, and then there's your podcast right there. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. There are a lot of different ways that you can do it, from bare bones, totally free. You got a free Zoom account, or like, you said, literally you could just do it on your phone, you know. Um, to a more advanced, more sophisticated podcast where somebody hires out somebody like yourself who has been doing this for so long, and you can create a more polished, finished product. And so a lot of it depends on where you're at in your business and what fits. So somebody who has a luxury service probably would benefit from having a more polished professional podcast, because it's got to represent you. It's got to make sense. It's got to be congruent. But if you consider yourself kind of a salt of the earth, just be real type of person, if you're recording your podcast while you're driving, or you're sitting at the beach, or whatever you're doing, that actually can be perfect for you. And maybe that's why your client is so successful, is because there is a tremendous amount of congruence. Who he is and who he's showing up as on his podcast is obviously really going to resonate with his audience. So it's worth considering for anybody listening. What is my branding? What is my self-image? What is the image of my business? And how can I do this in a way that is going to really represent what we offer, who I am? And reach out to somebody like yourself and get some guidance, get some help, get some support with all of that. The cool thing is, like you said, there are no rules. We get to create the rules. It's your platform, it's your show. So I love that. And I hope that maybe that piece, in and of itself inspire some people who have been maybe overcomplicating it for themselves.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing. People can really overcomplicate it, and it really comes down to what the budget is. I mean, that client that I have who records on his phone in the car, he still does hire me to work on the episodes and get them out because it still is a lot of that still is kind of busy work that a lot of entrepreneurs, business owners, and leaders aren't going to be spending their time doing.
Absolutely. It's not really practical for someone who is already very busy in their business to be editing shows and creating, graphics and doing all of those types of things. And all of that stuff can be hired out and outsourced.
Yes, exactly. I think that is a whole other conversation. The importance of outsourcing and a lot of the fears and struggles people experience around that.
Well, why don't we just scratch the surface on that real
Yeah. Yeah,
quick?
yeah. Well, honestly, what I've seen a lot of is that people treat their business like their baby. I'm sure you've heard that before, and they have a lot of themselves wrapped up in the business, and so that makes outsourcing difficult. I always try to encourage people to remember that you are not your business. Yeah, okay, I am passionate about my business. I enjoy what I do. I believe in what I do. I believe in the product that I deliver to my clients. And I think it's something beneficial and I think it's something impactful. However, I don't have a lot of my own personal emotions tied up in the success of my business. If my business were to fail, I don't like yeah, that would suck and yeah, I'd have to start over and try something else, but like that doesn't make me a failure or a bad person. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, I like my business. I love my business. I'm very passionate about it. But I have absolutely no problems at all outsourcing because that helps the business grow and it helps free up my time. And that's kind of what that comes down to. And talked about that a lot of I've talked about that a lot actually on my podcast recently with some guests. Kind of been top of mind for me with what I do and just thinking about it. Like I said, people have a lot of their emotions tied up in their business, and that can make that kind of thing difficult because it's hard to trust someone with what is essentially a piece of yourself, right? If someone is at that place where it kind of feels like their business is a part of them, then well, that's difficult to outsource a part of yourself. So that's do you know what I mean? Have you experienced that as well? Because I know a lot of people have seen that.
Yeah, well, what I've seen a lot and personally experienced early on in my business was a lot of scarcity consciousness and
Yeah,
also fear that somebody was gonna F it up, honestly,
yeah,
especially when you're coming from the environment of working at a job, working for someone, because if you personally were a great employee, then you've got a somewhat clean conscience about it, but you've probably witnessed a lot of your coworkers who maybe are slacking on the job or they're doing terrible work, they're really effing things up. And so we have oftentimes these fears that when we hire someone, we're going to get screwed over. And there's this whole kind of consciousness for a lot of business owners that it's like me versus my employee. Now, gratefully, a lot of people outgrow that and it becomes less of an issue. But I have to say that I've worked with a lot of clients that have been very established business owners in small to medium sized businesses with a ton of employees working for them, and they still have a lot of that idea that you can't trust people. You got to micromanage. You've got to be, on top of them all the time. Somebody's always out to screw you. And regardless of whether you have a small business and you're a solopreneur or you only have a couple of people that you contract out to or a couple of people that work directly for you, or you have a larger business with a lot of people, you've got to really check in with yourself and what are your beliefs. Do you believe you can trust people? Do you trust yourself to hire the right contractors, the right people? Are you hiring for quality, or are you hiring from scarcity? Because a lot of those things are going to influence the outcome. If you expect yourself to get screwed over, more than likely you're going to hire the perfect people to prove to you that you are justified in your point of view.
Oh yeah.
If you're terrified of spending money, you're going to hire the cheapest person that you possibly can. And in many cases, you're not going to have the best return on your investment. And
Oh
so
yeah.
we have to always be willing to challenge our fears and expand our consciousness to accept that there are people who can do it so much better than we can. And
Oh
that
yeah.
our, if like in your case, podcasting is your business. So of course it makes sense, right, for you to be doing your own editing and stuff like that. But for most people listening, it's not. And they're better off working on their thing in their business and delegating the things that are not their thing to
No.
somebody who it is their thing.
Well, the problem is there's no way to 100% avoid that risk. I mean, that risk is present when you're hiring someone. You could hire the wrong person, and that person could kind of screw you over later down the road. But that's, I mean, that's the game. There's no way to avoid that unless you just never hire anyone. Unless you just never hire anyone, and then you're gonna run into an even worse problem, which is you're gonna get burnt out, and then there's even more likelihood of the business kind of collapsing under that. If you hire someone and they don't end up being a good fit, then okay, yeah, maybe it sets you back a little bit, and maybe you lose some business or whatever the situation may be, but the business probably isn't going to crash and burn completely around you. You can just try again, try hiring someone else. So that's the thing, is that the risk isn't, the risk is there and you can't 100% avoid it, but the problem is that stops people from trying to outsource at all. And I mean, if you're, and there's nothing wrong with being a solopreneur. Some people want to be in that space, and that's totally fine. But if you're like an honest to God business owner, if you're the owner of a business, you need to outsource. I mean, that's just kind of how that works. I don't think you think you think of Joe Rogan, right? An incredibly successful podcaster. Does he edit his own podcast? I'm gonna go ahead and assume no. Does Elon Musk build Teslas? No, no, he doesn't. Like it's you have to, if you're actually a successful business owner, the reality of the situation is that you have to have a team. You have to have support. You have to have people you're working with, and that is there's that risk, but you have to take that risk, I think.
Absolutely. All right, we have burned through some time here, haven't we? All right, Evan, how can our listeners connect with you?
Well, I encourage everyone listening to this podcast to check out our episode on my show as well. Path to Podcast Success is the name of my podcast. You can listen to that wherever you listen to your podcasts. So I encourage anyone listening to check that out as well. And then other than that, my own personal website is path2podcastsuccess.com. You can find the podcast there as well as more information about me. And then, of course, I encourage everyone listening, if you are interested about podcasting in any way or want to connect with me, you can do so. I'm on Facebook, Evan Johnson, or Instagram, Evan Johnson Podcast. That is pretty much what my online presence looks like.
Love it. Thank you so much, Evan. It was so fun having you on my podcast this time. Appreciate all of the golden nuggets that you shared with us.
Thank you.
And of course, thank you to all of our listeners. You know, we're doing this for you. If you haven't already subscribed, make sure you do so. And until next time, we will see you in the next episode.